Hey guys, Warman here. We're back once again with the latest news and updates regarding Medieval 3. Today it's going to be about quality over quantity, because really the main thing we're going to be discussing today is the recent livestream. The only other post made by Live since the last time we spoke also relates to one of the topics covered in the livestream. So, there we go. Before we dig into this, just an obligatory reminder that my work on these videos has no bearing or impact on the progress with the upcoming anniversary update. It's different team members. Now we got that out of the way, let's begin. Now, I made a video giving my thoughts on one of the things from that live stream earlier, but there's more stuff to talk about that. I've been thinking some stuff over, I've had time to process what's going on, so yeah, we'll talk about that more later. I did raise a bunch of questions in our coverage thread related to the live stream, but as of me making this video, Live has not responded yet. Nor has he responded to the first batch of fan questions I sent his way after the last video. I'm sure he'll get to the questions when he can. He always does. In the lead up to the live stream, they also made a recap thread. According to the recap thread, they're focusing more on responding to existing threads and topics, and not so much doing anything new. Which explains a lot. It explains why there isn't as much news to talk about. It is what it is. Despite how much more transparent the Med3 team is being, there's still clearly some boundaries here, I've noticed. And there's still stuff that's too early to discuss properly. I can understand that. Also, we really appreciate the shout out to our thread in the recap. Awesome to see, and God knows there's a lot of answers in there, and I do get the vibe that most people don't know about them. But anyways, let's get to the main event. The way this is going to work this time is we're going to be talking about things in the same order as they're discussed in the live stream, including our formal responses to the questions they've asked. So first up, we got some more concept art. We got an updated look on the Kohlenstoffers, and yeah, these guys look great. These might be some of the most detailed pieces of concept art we've gotten yet. Seriously, and I love these little breakdowns here. For the fun of it, I tried to recreate the concept art with variants from our version of this unit, and the results were once again mixed. Again, just like with last time, there's several reasons for these differences. Could be a different point in the century, different design decisions, etc. We also got the first unit concept art from the French, in the form of these men-at-arms here. And these guys are from the, I think they said early 14th century? Again, they look great. I feel like it's also prudent that we compare this concept art to the concept art we got from the Imperial Knights of the same century a few months ago, because it's great for illustrating my points because they're both basically knights. And as you can see, while they look quite similar, there's also quite a few differences. And that really helps make things more interesting. This is what we like to see. Like I said before, this is the kind of variety that Medieval 3 needs. Please, please Med3 team, keep doing this. Across all factions, this is absolutely what you guys should be doing, so keep it up. Also, check this out. Unlike the Kohlenstoffers, I was actually able to find similar variants from the Tier 2 French Knights that we can use to compare to this concept art. I mean, it's not perfect, but as you can see, it's almost exact this time, which is really cool. Now, to be clear, I'm not doing this to claim they copied us. I'm just literally doing this for the fun of it. The fact that this similar, however, is still very significant in a different way. It's a well-known fact of our mod that we strive to make our units as historically accurate as possible within the limitations of the game. Are we perfect? No. Do some rosters still not match that standard yet? Yes. But that's the overall impression and intention we're going for, and something I think we've gotten quite capable at least as much as modders can. Historical accuracy has always been more in the domain of the Total War mods. The Total War games themselves have infamously been more about authenticity instead of accuracy. And that's how I was expecting Medieval 3 to be too, at least somewhat. But this? When was the last time a vanilla unit could go toe-to-toe with a mod's unit counterpart in terms of historical accuracy? And to be clear, I'm not talking about the quality of the unit itself, because obviously a game is going to have better quality work than almost any mod. I'm strictly talking about historical accuracy here. And this is still huge. Seriously, this would be like if Rome 2 came out and the units looked almost identical to how they looked in Europa Barbarum. And if you know the history of that mod, you know precisely how much of a big deal that would have been. This is the same thing, and we'd love to see it. Now, of course, this is just concept art, things can change, but the whole point of concept art is that it lays the intent for how the unit is gonna look. So I'm not expecting any drastic changes here. I mean, look at the progression between this earlier art of the Kohlenstoffers and now. The only significant change is the Sir code here, and to be honest, this new version looks a lot better. Everything else is the same though, just higher quality. Also, to be clear, since I know some people are gonna bring it up, Yes, the gameplay and the mechanics are important, arguably more important than historical accuracy. I understand that. But that's not going to stop me from giving credit where it's due, especially since if Med 3 does bomb, I don't want stuff like this to be caught in the crossfire and have the series backpedal from a good decision. It wouldn't be the first time with Total War. Next up, we got this huge piece of concept art, and this is pertaining to the heraldry and color and how it's being reflected across the units. This was awesome. And we're using the Holy Roman Empire as the poster boy again. And just like with some of the other pieces of concept art from last time, it's deliberately not readable because it's a work in progress and subject to change still. The absolute bastards. At least they said they plan on posting the full image online later though. I hope they actually do. Right, so where do we begin with this? Well, I guess we can go over some of these notes. Despite their best efforts, I can actually read some of this. Visual read hierarchy and priorities. Number 1 priority, player versus enemy, so you can tell whose units are yours and whose are the enemies. Authenticity, medieval authenticity. Number 3, region. Again, that's reasonably stored where the unit comes from. We also have this thing right here with different categories for different kinds of colors and emblems. Faction, region, dynasty, and I have no idea. I think that's supposed to be random. Your guess is as good as mine as what that means. I don't know what else you could have for emblems besides those 3 categories. Even as zoomed out as it is, there's still a lot that can be gleaned here, both from the unit appearance standpoint as well as the coloring. For the most part, I like how the colors are integrated. Seriously, this is a very striking sight. Factional colors shine from the most here, but there's definitely enough spattering to some of the other layers. I also like how, at least on the knights/nobles and the upper mid-status soldiers, the balding on the horses will match the rider. That is excellent, and I hope that makes it through production. That was always one of the things we couldn't really do in our mod, just due to the way mounts and units are set up in Attila. Now, as good as this is, there's still some room for improvement. I think that there should be banners for the region as well as the faction and dynasty, or maybe just have the dynasty banners only be a thing if the unit is coming from the crown lands, or maybe have the emblem for the region on the shields or gambits somewhere, like some kind of hint, because otherwise I don't think the region aspect of the color scheme is coming through enough. Like, it's almost there, it just needs some kind of marker to kind of bring it all together, if that makes any sense. There's still a lot to talk about this, but I'll save that for later. For now, let's move to the first major topic brought up on the livestream, dynasties and characters. It's actually quite fascinating how even though the Holy Roman Empire is the poster boy for their roster discussions, whenever we're looking at stuff campaign side, we just go back to Iberia. But hey, it's kinda cool to see how things are progressing. So there was a lot of stuff that was finally confirmed, and it was great seeing some of the stuff actually visualized, even if it's literally all mock-ups and placeholders. They were playing as Castile, or more accurate perhaps the concept of Castile. We see several noble houses here, and to Creative Assembly's credit, they're all legit families that were a thing in this setting, and they even got the right ruling house for Castile at the start, complete with the right coat of arms. Now, there's a bunch of weird quirks and oddities I'm not really going to touch on here, because so much of what we're seeing is placeholders several ways over. Like, all the characters are procedurally generated right now, so we need to disregard names and family placements. And that's also how I'm going to treat stuff like the settlement positioning issues that are apparently a thing going on here. Also, as an amusing side note, Aragon is apparently on the ropes in this playthrough, since apparently they lost territory to Navarre. And we also have these Navarrese characters having a party at the capital. I don't know what they're doing, but I don't care because it cracked me up. One major piece of news is that they said they have no plans for skill trees in Med 3. Characters may have emergent qualities like traits or auxiliaries, but they want that to progress via the character's dynasty, like a family trait of sorts instead. No skill trees. They want it to be like a form of continuity that all characters of a house might possess. As an example, Life says you could develop the Welfs into a proud, independent, fierce family, and you can turn the Stalfers into like civic administrators and empire builders. On a related note in the stream, they also talked about how they're veering away from agents like merchants and diplomats, and instead want to lean toward having certain characters go down those paths instead. And we can see how there's a character that seems to have different options as they're moving around here. So if I understand this right, one character might become a traditional Total War general, but another one might become the one you send on diplomatic missions, the one you set to meet with another war or mediate or something. They also said characters can help negotiate trade deals too, establishing trade routes similar to merchants in Med 2. Another crucial reveal is that various houses can be involved in the affairs of multiple factions, presumably through things like marriage, which is excellent. I was hoping for something like this. There's a lot of factions that need that kind of noble house intermingling. I can imagine playing as France and having the Plantagenets getting roped in England's affairs, while still being part of your business from something like this. We can also see how Dynasties have a separate slot underneath the faction here. I presume this is why Dynasties might have a separate color now. This also helps illustrate how factions can change hands in terms of the ruling house. One major thing this livestream showed, which was actually kind of discussed before but it's interesting to see it visualized, were the types of dilemmas one might encounter. In this case, we have a debate over whether or not they should let a military order build a building in this certain area or not, increasing the power and influence of the church. And different families have different stances on this, and you have to manage them all. Overall, I liked what I saw. Like always, we need to see how this is executed, but so far, I think this is a solid approach. I like how Dynasties are so separate from the faction as a whole, so the system is designed to have factions change hands if things go a certain way. I do have some slight concerns over the use of characters leaning into certain niches. I think it does make sense that characters can become good at diplomacy or commerce or something like that, but I hope they keep in mind not to have this be too rigid. Also, I think merchants do need to still be a separate thing, at least in certain factions like Venice anyway. This other point of concern is probably obvious, so I'm not going to spend that much time with it. When dealing with events and dilemmas like this, it's very important that these things are interested and handled well, especially if they want to make sure these things have long-lasting consequences. Regrettably, not everything I had questions about was answered, most notably vassals. I still don't know if my running theory on internal vassals is correct. I suppose that makes sense, considering we're in Iberia and there's really no vassals to be found, but it's still a shame we didn't get any confirmations here. There was also no mentions of titles or whether or not personal unions were going to be a thing. Now obviously marriages are going to be a thing, but whether or not that could lead to a personal union of combining two factions together, that still hasn't been confirmed. Another thing not technically confirmed, but I think we can reasonably lock it in now unless proven otherwise, is the fact that you can pick sides in factional civil wars. Between how dilemmas work and how the ruling house can change hands, I would be shocked if you couldn't pick a side here. So yeah, solid stuff. Before we move on to the next topic of the livestream, I want to answer the questions asked by the Med3 team. We're going to skip this one since it's been a long time since I played Rome 2, and I just have more to say about the other two. In terms of what kinds of political plays or plots I would want to see represented, again, personal unions. This was very much a thing, especially in places like Iberia. I feel like this could be a great way to make your faction grow in size without fighting. I mean, political marriages in general should be very common in this game and should have a ripple effect on the faction. And depending on which dynasty is marrying into which, that could lead to increased friction and problems. Going to Iberia, we see two houses with different stances on a topic. If members from both families get married and it becomes one house, there should absolutely be problems because of the different stances. Marriages should also have the ability to go sour. Maybe they can't produce offspring. Maybe the aforementioned differences in opinion prove too much. Maybe the people simply don't like the new king or queen. Maybe the Pope doesn't like one of them and threatens to excommunicate. The possibilities are vast. I also think titles should be a thing if they aren't already. Every crown in this game should function as a title, and every faction, even if they're as small as an internal vassal, should double as a title. I recall a while back, Life said an internal vassal can be created by the ruling house, gifting a vassal to another house. Yes, absolutely do that. I think we can take that even further as well, and I think a faction leader, for a variety of factors, could and should have multiple titles and be able to press claims on them, or at the very least, have the option to. Like, imagine if you're playing as France. A generation ago, the ruling family has one of its members marry into the English royal family. Now, several generations later, their descendant is now pressing their claim as King of France. Because they're still part of your family and part of that dynasty, they do have the right to do that. But suffice to say, the current monarch doesn't want to give up what's his, aka the circumstances behind the 100 Years' War. See what I mean? It's too significant of a detail to not be in this game, at least in my opinion. As for the second question regarding archetyping, I touched on this a little bit already. Nothing should be too rigid. But to elaborate, I think some family members should be able to go against the grain. Whether it's due to their personality or competence, there needs to be outliers. Going back to that Starforce example Life said, what if one of the family members is not so competent? They're a dumb, vicious brute that doesn't have the talent for civic administration. Now you gotta figure out how to deal with him. And why not take this even further? What if the outlier ends up becoming the head of the dynasty somehow and starts changing the direction of the family? I think that kind of fluidity is key to really make it feel like these families are alive and dynamic. You can still have your niches and archetypes, but nothing is ever set in stone. And besides, wouldn't that be a great way of keeping things fresh in the late game? Moving on to the second major topic, trading and economy, a good amount of this was already discussed elsewhere in different forum posts and other live streams. Like, we already know there's going to be inter-region trading, as well as the usual trade between factions. Also, as stated earlier, characters can establish trade routes. They also plan on having this be portrayed visually on the map, which is interesting because I thought they said they weren't doing that. Guess they changed their mind. There's a lot of emphasis on trade routes and networks and really growing that web of connections. And there's more moving parts this time around, helpfully illustrated by this graph. So there's a lot of nuance to this. Trade is now in tiers, and we're going to use the iron example Life does. You can mine enough iron to have some, you can mine enough iron to trade it, and you can mine enough to control who can access the trade. So, if I understand this right, not only are resources themselves tradable, but the connection to trade them is just as important. And just like in previous titles, trading with other factions requires diplomatic deals, whether it's a payment to get access or even stuff like favors apparently. I think there's some solid potential with a system like this. The idea of leveraging not only the resources, but the privilege to get them is so deliciously evil. I mean capitalistic. I mean evil. And I love it. It reminds me of how important the spice trade was to Europe, and how when the Ottomans finally took Constantinople, they cut Europe off from that trade, which had a whole ripple effect that's beyond the scope of this video. And just like several other things in Med-Free, I like how they're genuinely trying to innovate and improve on the old tired systems in Total War. Like always, say it with me everyone, we need to see how it's executed. And the Med-Free team is very much aware of the potential pitfalls already. It shouldn't be just meaningless number crunching, and it needs to be a good reason to want these resources in the first place. Going back to the iron example here, obviously that could be useful for better armor production and the like. So yeah, a lot of moving parts, and each area could have something go wrong. Moving on to answer Creative Assembly's questions for this part, I honestly don't know how to separate my answer here, so consider this my response to both these questions at once. I would love to engage with this whole idea of trade access and this idea of earning the privilege to get resources from certain factions. Especially with the Italian city-states like Venice, there needs to be a certain amount of interplay here. Like differences in religion or culture should absolutely have an effect over how likely it is a faction is going to trade with you. For example, let's say the Amoravids want your iron. They try and negotiate with you, but you're not having it because they're Muslim and you're Christian. So, on the quote-unquote principle of that, you reject their offer. Or, you do give it to them at an inflated price. Or, you will only do it if they reject their alliance with the Hafsids. Depending on the needs and circumstances of certain factions, I think wars and conflicts should absolutely arise in relation to trade, where wars can be fought over not just a certain resource, but the right to access it from another faction. For example, Venice should be able to make other factions dance to their tune if they play their cards right trade-wise. The Pope wants to launch another crusade and they need Venice ships, but Venice won't help them without getting exclusive access to the spice trade. And in response to this, maybe Genoa declares war on Venice, maybe with the Pope's support. And one of the express goals of this campaign is not conquering new territory, but more to try and force Venice either out of the spice trade altogether, or at least force them to give up some of their share. And this is just on the top of my head, okay? I think really leaning into this along with the more common importance of certain resources would be a great way to spice up trade in Total War, as well as illustrating how often trade causes wars. It would make sense thematically with this series on top of being depressingly accurate. Moving on to the economy ascension, again, a lot of this we've discussed before. There's this idea of a war and peace cycle, and the idea that when there is a war, it should feel like the whole country, the whole faction is gearing up for that war. There's a fair amount of emphasis on the population and how it relates to all these systems in various ways. There's 3 major population groups and each has their own income and their own corresponding demand system. Basically, it's a more in-depth version of how Bretonnia worked in the Warhammer games, where the more people you draft and recruit into your armies, the slower and slower your economic output is, especially once you're below this demand threshold, as it were. And this relates to all 3 classes, by the way, not just the peasants. Certain administrative buildings or stuff like the keep, yeah, those require nobles. And just in general, there's a lot of emphasis about how nobles need to be balanced, and if you have too many, that leads to corruption. But you also can't just spam knights either. Speaking of corruption, I love how there's a little separate indicator there for corruption and how that siphons some money away. Very funny. They also talked of a war weariness system, and again, we've talked about some of this already. The more people that go into this war and die, the more the systems become strained, the harder it's going to be to maintain this war. Pretty straightforward stuff. Another thing they showed is that we can increase the yields of resource production, and certain regions have potential for higher yields than others. So yeah, some interesting stuff. As for my thoughts on it, well, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, we need to see how it's executed. You always have to be careful with limits like this, because it's easy to mess up. Also, I struggle to see how slave populations like Janissaries could factor into these 3 different categories. Not to mention other factions would have tribesmen instead, which also doesn't perfectly fit into any of these categories. Then again, considering how places like the Steppes are not getting fleshed out with Medieval 3 on launch, I guess we'll go back to that later. As for the last question they asked, I would expect going tall economically means you have a lot of power and influence over the resources you've really honed in on, but also have a lot more dangers because of it. See my earlier point about the privilege to get a certain resource and the potential conflicts and issues from it. That is magnified even further if you're really invested into it. You have to fight like hell to keep control over it. If you play your cards right, other factions will help you, if only to keep access to that resource. Also, depending on what the resource is, leveraging it in your own faction is important too, and just as noticeable. Like if you're leaning into iron, you should be able to equip your troops really well, and comparatively cheaper because of the surplus. Going wide means you should be able to take hits if you lose certain resources, but you should have comparatively small numbers of it in the first place. What will you do to get more? Now we're at the opposite side of the conflict, just as I said. Will you do the bidding of another faction, or muster your forces and make them share? And again, that's just off the top of my head. I really hope that the Med3 team can flesh this out properly like they want, because going for depth and detail I think is going to be paramount for this game. Now let's get to the last and certainly biggest thing worth discussing today. The reveals we got about factions, and oh boy, we're gonna be here a while. This is like the 2nd or 3rd time I think one of these videos has ended with discussions about factions. Before we get into this, I just want to put up a disclaimer that what I'm about to say is my own opinion. This is a very divisive and intense topic right now, and I'd be lying if I said I was impressed with people's takes on it. I think I've seen pretty much every possible take you could have regarding this topic, and most of what I've seen is just bad. There's no elegant way for me to put it. It's just a bad take. I think the Total War community in general kinda has a serious armchair game dev problem, where everyone thinks they knows how long things should take, and it's led to some consistently bizarre and unrealistic expectations. However, underneath all the bad arguments and disingenuous whataboutisms, there are some genuine concerns and issues, and these I either agree with, or at the very least I understand the viewpoint. In the lead up to this video, I did a good amount of research of my own, lest I find myself guilty of the same ignorance as some of the other people I've seen. So, to reiterate, these are just my opinions. I like to think they're well informed based off my experience with this mod and my own research, but again, they're still my opinions. So, out of the gate, we need to debunk some misinformation. Creative Assembly has not given us an exact number of playable factions yet. I repeat. Creative Assembly has not given us a number, so anyone saying that it's going to be 10 or something like that is spreading misinformation. I mean, it's not an unfounded guess, and we'll get to the specifics of that later, but the simple fact is all they have said so far is that the number of playable factions in Med 3 is going to be comparable to previous Total War titles. And they've said that several times in fact. Furthermore, the factions in the poll are not the only factions that will exist in the game. Seriously, you had people acting like these were going to be the only factions that existed on the campaign map, mocking the idea of getting to Baghdad and not seeing the Great Seljuks, for example. But that's also obviously wrong. You can clearly see the Amorphids in the VAR and the campaign build. I can understand why people are frustrated over the fact that these factions are not going to be playable, but there's still a difference between a faction that isn't there at all and one that's not playable. There's just enough of a difference that it means something. It is important. Before we get into the weeds of this, let's go over the criteria Creative Assembly themselves have given for how they determine what faction should be playable. I'm just going to read this verbatim from the website. When we think of a good set of playable factions, we think about how well known is this faction known amongst the public and among fans of history? What factions do people expect? And what factions would be missing from most people if they weren't part of the playable set? Everyone knows England and may want to play as England, whereas other realms are less known. How unique is the starting situation, and how interesting and varied are the paths that a faction may take throughout a campaign? A faction with a unique starting situation may rise in priority a bit compared to a faction that has a more generic starting situation or limited paths through a campaign. How unique or compelling would potential mechanics of this faction be? If a faction lends itself to interesting unique mechanics, then that can move the needle to include them as playable factions. We also look at the overall historical significance, of course, and generally we want to make sure we have the overall extent of the map covered in a balanced fashion. Honestly, this criteria is reasonably solid, and I think the way they worded it here was way better than how they put it on the live stream. Life, Powell, some free advice, don't name drop Hollywood. I understand what you meant, but take it from a film major who has a bone to pick with most historical media. Mentioning Hollywood in juxtaposition with anything medieval gives a very specific intention that I would argue is not reflective of med-free. What you guys have done already is light years better than anything Hollywood has ever done. You know what I mean? When I think Hollywood, I don't think of stuff that looks like this. So, with all due respect, don't sully your project by name-dropping Hollywood with it. Anyways, they have 6 factions locked in. It's very strange that they haven't locked in any Iberian factions or any Italian factions, considering how much they focus on Iberia, and the fact that Venice was apparently locked in at some point and then not. What the heck made them backpedal? Before we get into the factions actually mentioned in the poll, I just want to address the Med-Free team's argument for why certain factions and regions are not in the running at all. For launch, we are prioritizing and focusing the work on the broader European geography, and any faction that would not be covered fully by this map extent is not something we want to focus on at this stage. Examples for this are the Great Seljuks, Mesopotamia towards the Hindu Kush, the Mongols, naturally way out of reach in 1140, and the Russian principalities, not covered entirely. While I understand this argument, I think this was a big mistake, probably the first real design decision I categorically disagree with outright. Take it from us, people don't mind playing a faction whose domain isn't fully on the map. We have plenty of fans who play the Kromazanians, the Gurids. Hell, we've had people play Norway when it was just a horde. People don't care. They just embrace the opportunity to play as a significant faction that they think is interesting. In fact, I made a poll on our YouTube and on our Discord asking how many people play these factions, and the results kind of speak for themselves. Hundreds of people voted and they made their voices known. Unfortunately, given the circumstances, I do think it's too late to remedy this decision now. There's already enough factions in the mix as it is. It's just something I want to put out there for future reference. As for the extent of the map, I'm mostly fine with it. I mean, at least enough. Honestly, I think the lack of Persia and the full Arabian Peninsula is the most jarring omission to me, especially with the context for it. Med-Free does feature most of Scandinavia this time around, and that's actually something more than Med-2. And you can totally see where they're going to expand the map, which I believe they confirmed they were going to expand the map eventually in Flash Rings Out. Which I think is ultimately a net positive, sort of. Because I think when it comes to this kind of speculation, everyone is allowed their one unrealistic idea. For me, my unrealistic idea was having them eventually expand the map all the way to China and Japan, and have that be a soft launch for Shogun Free, especially if we get later start dates. With this reveal, it's gone from impossible to very unlikely. Now, as for the part of the map that's actually going to be there on launch, there's a lot to talk about, and I apologize for sort of beating around the bush with this. I think the selection of factions for this poll is actually pretty solid. I'm also glad these categories are just rough approximations, because otherwise they make no sense. For example, why is Bulgaria not a Balkan state? And I'm also very surprised and impressed that Georgia made it on here, although I'll be shocked if enough people vote for it to be playable. To be clear, they put this poll together so they know what factions they should focus on first, or at the very least factor the community's input in that decision. So I do believe that all these factions will be playable eventually, and they will all have their day. Like, I speculate this will be the eventual final group of factions for this game, at least for this part of the map. Of course, the sticking point is how many of these factions are going to be DLC, and this is where things have gotten so messy, and there's a lot of factors to this discussion, most of which people haven't talked about, so strap in. There's several aspects of this discussion I want to tackle. First of all, let's talk about potential faction counts in comparison to other Total War games. Like I said earlier, you had a lot of people saying it was going to be 10. And this was mainly for 2 reasons. First of which, you can only vote for 4 factions in the poll. And given how there's 6 locked in already, but the thing is, I disagree. I think they just did 4 options to really incentivize people to vote for the factions they want the most. If they had 23 options, people would either just pick the same faction like 23 times, or just choose all of them, which would make the poll largely meaningless. The other reason why people are saying it's going to be 10 is because of how it's a common faction number for Total War games. And when we examine the data, yeah, that part is actually not unfounded at all. As you can see, most Total War games fall between 8 to 12. Rome 2 at 9, Attila, Warhammer 3, Thrones, Fall of the Samurai all had 10. Rome 1 and Empire had 11, and Shogun 2 at Three Kingdoms had 12. Now, free LCs do boost the numbers a bit for some of those factions, but we'll get back to that later. But I don't think that's enough for an outright confirmation, especially when you consider that both medieval titles had the most amount of playable factions. 11 or 12 factions would still certainly be better than 10, even if it's not by much. Before I go into my thoughts and stance on this, I want to address a couple other bad arguments and takes I've seen. Having factions be locked behind a DLC paywall is not a scam. Is it a good business practice? Probably not. But just because you don't like a business practice doesn't mean it's a scam. I know it's a minor point at the end of the day, but that's still a pet peeve of mine I just had to get off my chest. Just like how I wish some people would stop calling art they don't like from this game AI. Like pretty much any time concept art has come out for this game that some people don't like, they just call it AI. God forbid you just say you don't like it. The last bad take I want to debunk is the argument that all the pole factions should be playable at launch, and to do anything less is a scam, or it's greedy, or some other flavor of bad faith or laziness. I even had someone try to tell me that people expecting that were not being unrealistic at all, because of the roster sharing among certain regions, which is cherry picking at best. So first of all, no Total War game has ever had 29 to 30 playable factions on launch. The closest would be Med 2 at 21, and even that is inflated because only 17 factions are playable in the campaign mode in Med 2. And before you tell me you can easily mod the game to make the rest playable, that doesn't count and you know it. So you think that Med 3 should have 2 to 3 times the amount of playable factions in any Total War game to date, flying in the face what they've told us several times? And you think that's not unrealistic? No, I'm sorry, it's painfully unrealistic to expect that. And to really kind of illustrate my point with this, I want to kind of go into this topic a bit deeper, and this is where working on this mod is really helpful for giving a more informed perspective. I think people have seriously underestimated the amount of work that needs to go into every faction's roster for this game, even with unit sharing. And I also probably blame Warhammer for this too. We're mostly going to be talking about the Holy Roman Empire, since that's the faction we've gotten the best look at by far and is great for illustrating my points. The only confirmed factional units for the Holy Roman Empire so far are the Ministrales and the Imperial Knights. So you think that's 2 units so far, right? Wrong. The count is actually 7. According to this chart from an earlier livestream, the Imperial Knights have 4 different versions based off the century, and the Ministrales have 3. This is what I mean about how Warhammer-itis has infected the conversation a bit, because if you come into Med 3 from Warhammer, when you think of Knights, you just think of a singular unit. But the thing is, in historical titles, and especially mods, including ours, it's actually more complex than that. In historical titles, there's usually several variants of Knights depending on the period and the century, and the way the unit looks will change, sometimes drastically depending on the century. Helmets would change, armor would change, weapons and shields would change, and all these things will need new assets. And this applies to every single unit in the game, from factional units to cultural units to faction block units to cultural block units. You have to start thinking about these units as clusters, and not as singular things like in the Warhammer titles. Aside from some units maybe at the very end or the very beginning, like these possible Gothic Knights here, you better believe each unit we're talking about has at least 2 versions. And that's not even taking into account the armor progression system on top of the period system. Though if this is any indication, if a unit has different armor variants, they don't have as many period variants. But still, the result is anywhere from 2 to as many as 4. Also, in my opinion, the distinction between faction block units and factional units actually doesn't mean anything, because there could be a bunch of Imperial faction block units, but if the only playable Imperial faction is the Holy Roman Empire, then functionally they might as well be factional units, because unlike the cultural units, you can't get access to those faction block units if you're playing as another faction. And it also should be noted that every region will have its own cultural units, and if they're anything like the ones in the Holy Roman Empire, they're going to be factored into various factions rosters. And considering how they could be upwards of 5 cultures, and each culture can have up to 3 units, 5 times 3 times another 2 up to 4. That is not an insignificant amount of work for just one faction's roster. And if you're thinking, can't they just reuse assets? Well, Yeah, they can, but the mileage varies a lot. For example, some units can share shields. Like, I would say the 1200s and 1300s Imperial Knights can probably share the same heaters, but at the beginning you would probably have kites, and at the end you would have the Talkshare shields. I apologize if I mispronounced that, guys. And sure enough, that's what we see here. Face models, skin models, some units might be able to share gloves or gambesons, but for every one model that can be reused, there's 2 or 3 that can't be. And this is something we have a ton of hands-on experience with this mod. And it's a lot of work. And unlike with a mod, the Medfree team is making all these assets from the ground up. This is why I was perfectly fine with Medfree's time frame, and why I roll my eyes every time I see someone demand that Creative Assembly have the game be a longer time span, like from say 1000 to 1500. It's too much work and you don't know what you're asking for. Seriously, you can see this illustrated very well in this beautiful piece of concept art, and that's why I keep showing it on screen despite the blurriness. You can see how much work has to go into this, and this is just one faction. Now some of you might be thinking, but Warman, Medieval 2 was able to do 21 factions 20 years ago. How come Creative Assembly can't just do that same number now? Have you ever actually looked at what Med 2 did for its rosters? Med 2, to its credit, does have a period and armor system. We all know this. And at first, you might think Med 2 was more detailed. The naming system was a bit different, but in practice we go from early knights to mid-knights to later knights to a final thing at the end. And each version, whether we're talking about the male knights, the feudal knights, the imperial knights, also has an armor upgrade. So if we act like this is basically the same unit, that means we got 6 variants, 2 more than Med 3. But the devil's in the details. Med 2's armor upgrades vary. When we're talking about shared units and asset overlap, this is a better example of that, not what Med 3's doing. Large chunks of the Western European rosters in Med 2 look exactly the same, just with different colors. Now granted, since this is an older title, color differences are baked in, but still, seriously, many of these knights have the same heraldry even when it doesn't make sense. And many of the armor upgrades are also quite small, and one of them just turns one unit into another unit, and so on and so forth. Med 3 is going to be much more detailed than this. Unlike Medieval 2, Med 3 is doing what I hoped it was going to do, and is embracing the differences between knightly gear of different regions. And that takes a lot more time and effort. And this is also not taking into account the heraldry system and how that's going to be applied to every applicable model across every applicable period. But Warman, what about some of the other regions, like the Italians, the Spanish, or the Scandinavians? Certainly these factions will share some units. Why shouldn't these all be playable? Well, you're partially correct. I do speculate they will probably at least share the faction block units. And I will also concede the fact that if we're talking about like a gameplay standpoint, at least with the Italian factions, all the city-states absolutely could have something interesting about them that could justify them being playable. That's probably why they were all options here. But that aforementioned overlap is actually why I'm saying they could be cut for now. No disrespect to Genoa, Pisa, and Milan, but Venice is just simply that much better. Because if the choice is between 3 other Italian factions and factions from other regions, the other Italian factions lose because these other factions have more unique rosters on top of potential mechanics. You see what I mean? The fact that they share units is actually a weakness in this case. We have to remember that the Medfree team has to make sure everything they create is up to a professional standard, and they have deadlines to reach for this. And especially given how painfully impatient the community can be sometimes, yeah, they can't hold things off forever. Having said all that, where do I stand on this whole thing? Well, if the number of factions ends up being 10, yeah, no, I still wouldn't be a fan. I know that might be kind of shocking considering how I was just rebuking a lot of arguments people have been making, but even considering all that, I think having there only be 10 playable factions on launch really wouldn't be that good of an idea. I feel like that's a bridge too far and that's cutting too much. I feel like something like 15 would be a way better number, and I am more than willing to wait the extra time it would take in order for us to get 15 factions on launch. But let's say the launch number ends up being 10. Would it be enough to ruin Med 3? Not necessarily, especially since there's other factors in the situation I still haven't talked about yet. They said they wanted the campaign map to be more detailed than in previous titles. That was part of the justification for not having certain areas right away. And so far, I'm not sure if they back that up. On the one hand, the region count for Iberia seems to be comparable to Attila's map, aka it's not more detailed. On the other hand, no slots for settlements, and I get the vibe regions and settlements are going to be two separate things this time. I mean look, we can place down ports, castles, and maybe even small towns. I mean if so, that would add a lot more detail, a lot more moving parts, a lot more areas you need to conquer, and a lot more detail that would probably line up better with what they've been saying. Especially if these locales are given actual battle maps and they're not just some background element. We also cannot sleep on free LC factions. And this is something a lot of people I feel like have just categorically ignored. And these can certainly help lessen the blow, and believe it or not, major factions can be introduced via free LCs. Regarding Rome 2, Pontus was infamously introduced this way, and so were the Seleucids. Yes, that major Rome 2 faction was introduced via free LC. And when all is said and done, a lot of Total War games actually end up with like 14 or 15 factions from the free LC editions, which, assuming they don't come from other regions yet to be added, could add enough to the lineup to be acceptable, at least for me. There's a map I saw on the forum, by the way, that I think has the best lineup, and what do you know, it's around like 16-17 factions. Maybe I'll take out Kiev and put a Balkan faction there, but still, otherwise I think this would be a great baseline. I feel like going for 15 or 16 factions, something along that range, is the best case scenario here, because you have just enough factions to cover all the bases, it satisfies all the parameters Creative Assembly brought up, as well as being reasonable with the workload of what we could reasonably expect based on all the stuff I mentioned earlier. I feel like based off everything, this would be the best result. Now, if I had it my way, there would be no faction DLCs at all. I would save the DLCs for bigger things like map expansions and different start dates. In a perfect world, I would have all factions be free LC. That way we have a good balance here where each faction can get the work it needs, but they don't have to put everything behind paywalls to get things done. Another factor we need to consider is internal vassals. Like I said before, I think the combination of the regional retinue system, internal vassals, cultural units, and faction and block units are going to be how the Med-free team will make a lot of other factions quasi-playable. Flanders, Bohemia, and who knows how many others in other areas might be playable in this fashion, which I think might soften the blow. On a related note, I also want to briefly draw attention to how Pharaoh made like 25 minor factions playable when Dynasties came out. Might be cool to do that again on some level. Despite my criticisms of some of people's takes on the matter, the burden of responsibility is on Creative Assembly. They've told us they want to go for depth and detail, so I'm gonna hold them to that. I want every single faction and region in this game to have a lot of depth and effort, enough so no one can doubt they made the right call. And while some areas I think that's coming through already, other areas I'm still on the fence. And that's going to determine, at least for me, how much I'm going to tolerate faction DLCs for this game. It's that simple, they gotta earn it. So yeah, I think that covers everything. I'm not gonna lie, this has been a nightmare to write and record, but I do feel happy getting this out of my system. I'm predicting that there won't be that many more updates for Med-free for a bit, aside from whether or not life answers my questions, so we're gonna see how that goes. I do plan on making a video someday soon addressing what is perhaps the biggest elephant in the room regarding us and Med-free. Something that's kind of plagued a lot of this discussion since the very beginning. And I've been waiting for a slow period in Med-free news to discuss it, and I think that day is coming soon. As for the anniversary update, we're still trying to iron out the issues. Nothing too much else to say there, I'm afraid. Hopefully we'll have some updates soon, but as for now, I will see you guys later.